What's up YouTube? So today I want to look at a technique called clip to zero. So this is a bit more of an advanced mixing technique, and I would highly suggest anybody watching this video to go and watch the series of videos where I kind of learned this technique. I guess I kind of knew a lot of the theory behind it, but applying it in practice has been very helpful, and I've been diving into it quite a bit the last few weeks with good results. So the original video series was done by another YouTuber called Baphometrics. So I'm going to post all the links where you can find those videos in the description. I highly suggest going and checking out the entire series because they do a very good job of explaining like all the actual theory behind it and how to actually put it into practice. They answer most of the questions that I had about the subject. So this video is not going to be that kind of thing. I'm not going to be answering any of the like highly theoretical stuff behind the subject. I'm kind of just going to be putting it into practice and showing you guys the good results that I get from this technique. And I also want to show you a really cool thing within Cubase that just makes things a little bit easier to dial in this type of thing very quickly. So anyway, let's dive in and have a look. So here I've got a track that I've been working on. It's kind of at the point where I'm getting to the final mix stage. I'm very happy with it. However, I feel like I could get a little bit more loudness out of it. I feel like I could get a little bit more punch out of the entire mix. And using this specific technique, this clip to zero technique, is a very, very powerful way to kind of dial in that exact amount of loudness that you need. So I quickly want to talk about the idea of how I would set this up, the groups and all that kind of thing. I've also quickly just rendered out the exact mix as it is right now so that we can A/B compare it nearer the end of the video to see the actual difference gain match. Here's the idea. What I want to do is start setting up some groups. So I've got my kick and my bass stuff over here. Let's just make sure that all of this stuff is going to the kick and bass group. Let me just clean up this project a little bit as well. If we head over to Cubase's mixer, you can just hit F3, that's the hotkey for that. You can drop down this routing menu over here and you can quickly cycle through to see which channels are actually sending to which groups. Here I've got the kick and bass. I haven't actually assigned any like percussions groups or anything like that. And here I want to go through kind of how I do that kind of thing. These are my drums channels, and I've got another one here for the snare and one for the open hat. So I kind of want to group these a little bit differently. What I want to do is I want to group all my extra percussion stuff into a single group, and then I want my snare and my hi-hat in a single group and then together into a group. So let's say, for example, right click and say add group channel to selected tracks. And let's just call this aux percussion. I'm going to call this a subgroup. And main snare and open hat, add group channel to selected track. Let's call this main percussion subgroup. And now these two, we're going to send to another group we're going to call main percussion. So just to keep things a little bit more organized, what we can do is we can actually put these into a folder, which we can call main groups, and then the subgroups we can put into a folder as well, just to keep things a little bit organized. So I want all of my leads except for my main leads, except for this folder. I want all of these leads in a group. So let's pull up the mixer. Let's just add group channel to selected track. Let's call this aux synths subgroup, and then all the main leads, send these, add group channels to selected track. Let's call these main leads subgroup. These two together can go into main leads subgroups, main groups. And then the sound effects, I kind of just put everything together in one. Right, so everything should be grouped accordingly. So one of the cool things about the mixer is we can actually change the visibility options. So for example, we can actually change so that we're not seeing any of the audio tracks, instrument tracks, MIDI channels, etc. Here, for example, we can hide this Atmos channel. Like for example, we're only seeing these kind of group channels that we need. So I want to show you another cool trick. It's going to make sense when we start to add the clippers. So let's jump in. Let's actually just undo that and have a look at all of these channels quickly. What I want to do is select all of the audio channels in the entire project, right? And what I want to do is right click and say add VCA fader to selected channels. So now what this has done is this has created, let's call this Pre-Clip VCA. So what we can do is now disable or actually remove all of the audio channels, samplers, instrument tracks, that kind of stuff. And now we're left with all of our groups, our kind of main groups over here, all of our subgroups over here, and a VCA fader. And this one fader basically controls the entire mix of the track before the groups. So this is kind of like a gain into the group channels. So if, for example, we add clippers here, the adjustment of this VCA fader will adjust how much clipping is happening to the signal. Does that make sense? Just for a quick reference, for example, you can turn it halfway down and the balance of the entire mix stays the same. It's just much quieter. So this is essentially the same as just turning down the entire mix or the stereo output of the project. However, that is after the groups. So if we add clippers and stuff here, it's still going to clip the same depending on how we adjust the output. I don't know if you guys are following. So anyway, let's head over to the kind of main theory of this video, and that is the actual, clipping. So I guess the quick explanation of clip to zero is to build a series of cascading clippers that clip your signals ever so slightly to have a kind of more balanced overall kind of sausage at the end of the mix, a whole balanced overall kind of chunk of audio that won't need too much gain reduction in the mastering stage, so that that kind of mastering gain reduction is slightly less audible. There's pros and cons to this, obviously, because of the gain reduction aspects and the clipping aspects. However, that being said, is doing this beforehand and setting up your mix around this idea and then producing makes these little mistakes and stuff that might only come out in the mastering stage a lot more apparent. So for example, if there's sounds that are like poking through the mix and we're not noticing it in the actual mixing stage, if we're mix with the idea of clip to zero and these things are already kind of maximized and already kind of clipped, that chunk of poking out audio will distort and we'll hear it instantly while we're mixing the track, and it'll become apparent and we'll make those adjustments before we have to actually send it off to the mastering engineer and all that kind of thing. So this is very important, I think, nowadays, especially when so many producers are we're mastering our own stuff because there's maybe not much budget around, or we're just the output of music is so high that it's just more convenient to master your own tracks. Yes, obviously, again, there's pros and cons to this, but being able to get as kind of closer sound to a professional master in the mix is just going to make your tracks so much better, in my opinion. It's going to make you produce the tracks closer to what you want in the end, and I guess that means that the mastering engineer has to push the limits a little bit less. I hope you guys are following. So anyway, the idea that I've kind of like deduced from the entire series is that we want to obviously clip things like the kick and bass the least, and everything else in the track we can kind of clip so that the kick and bass is always the most prominent thing. It's always the thing that's going to be slamming that mastering limiter. I guess the idea is to put a bunch of clippers onto all of the groups and start adjusting them so that they're at the edge of the limits of kind of where they're supposed to be. And then say, for example, there's like one plucky synth or one percussion sound that kind of pokes out a little bit too much. You're either going to hear it, or the clipping is going to do the job of like not allowing it to clash in terms of the headroom of the rest of the mix. There's a couple of differences in the way that I've set my clip to zero projects up and my clip to zero mixes up than Baphometrix actually originally explained in the series. Is I use the clip to zero theory, but I still clip to about the same levels as I mixed beforehand. So I still mixed to -6, just because it's something that I've kind of always done. Most of the mastering racks that I kind of use for myself and, my video editing projects and everything, they're calibrated to work with audio that's already kind of bounced out at -6. I guess the theory is still the same. It doesn't matter at what volume. I could potentially clip to 0, then just turn my fader down -6 and export the project. It wouldn't really make a difference because we're working at 32-bit float anyway. There are a little bit of differences when it comes to analog modeling plugins, and that is explained in Baphometrics' series. So like I said, definitely go and check out the entire playlist on it. I'm going to post a link in the description. And yeah, let's get into the practical example because I've blabbered on quite a bit too much already. So like I said, I'm not going to explain too much of the theory behind everything. I'm kind of just going to show you the practical examples, and you can head over to the original series for the actual theory behind it. But one thing to remember is that soft clipping is kind of like saturation in that it kind of bends the linearity of your dynamics. So I generally head over to hard clipping, and if it is too apparent, then I kind of maybe go to soft clipping and tone things down a bit. Or if I want a saturation type of sound, I want an audible type of clipping, then I'll go with soft clipping. So just by default, I kind of set my clippers to hard clip and then work from there. I find that for this kind of more clinical use, it's a bit better to go that route. But again, go to Baphometrics' playlist, and a lot of the stuff is really explained with a lot more theory and a lot more explanation. Again, there are various different clipper plugins that you can use. Clip Shifter is a great one because there is a free option. However, I've kind of started using Standard Clip lately because it's actually really, really good. I like the kind of gain inputs, outputs, ceiling abilities. I like the kind of fact that you can mix in the soft clip nicely. So you kind of have the saturation amount, which is really cool. And it can actually oversample at ridiculously high rates. But again, it's whether you can actually hear that difference, I don't know. I've just kind of started using it because the interface is very clean and very easy to read. That's the main reason. But, quality, I guess, is subjective. So what we're doing here is we're just duplicating it across the entire mix, and I want to put it onto the output as well. Reason being is we can use the one on the actual stereo output to kind of read the amount of clipping that we might need to jump back into each of the tracks to fine tune. So notice how you push that setting to the extreme and the musical information is still there. Yes, it's distorted. Yes, it sounds ugly, but the musical information is still there. Everything that we need to know about the music is still there. So the important factor, the important thing to kind of get out of this is push things to the extreme here. Not that extreme, but push things to the extreme on the actual master output, and then you start to hear which of the sounds are maybe either adding or taking away too much from the musical information of the track or the important parts of the track, and start to fine-tune those a little bit more in the mix. So example is when we clip this way overboard, the kick kind of loses its power every time the snare hits. So now we can use that information to maybe go in and start clipping the percussions channels, or maybe side-chaining the percussions channels to the kick, or adjusting them ever so slightly, knowing that, if in very extreme limiting examples, these types of things are going to affect the amount of musical information that we can squash into that very thin range of headroom. And it's a similar thing with the leads channels. So you have the kind of main group, which is that vocal stabby sound. And then you have these sounds. So they're clashing a little bit. So we can maybe go in and adjust the dynamics of those on a kind of individual level to make the most of the entire mix. So here we're actually clipping it quite extreme. You know, we've got quite a bit of gain reduction happening on this channel. However, we're not losing too much information from this main hi-hat and main snare. We're losing a little bit of that transient and a little bit of that pokiness, but that kind of thing isn't actually that important when we're dealing with such a layered mix. It's those little way-offs, those little kind of balances, which I think are the most important thing. Like, how much of what instrument do you want to be sitting at most up front in the mix? And everything else can be clipped ever so slightly and, you know, adjusted ever so slightly in the dynamics so that that main element is really popping through. And it becomes really apparent when we actually start to crush the overall dynamics of the mix, like I was showing you just now. So here we've made about a 5 dB of headroom difference on this channel by just clipping it, and it doesn't feel like the loudness is actually affected whatsoever. And so let's expand this idea to some of the other channels. We can maybe even push the limits a little bit further with some of these aux groups, for example, the aux percussion and the aux synths, because they're not as much important elements in the mix. And sometimes, even in examples like this, sounds can actually benefit from extreme clipping. So with this very kind of glitchy percussion layer, it was a little bit all over the place in terms of the dynamics. Some things were pokey, some things were a little bit like flatter. So just kind of clipping it to the extreme just makes everything a bit of a square wave, I guess, not in a negative sense. Everything kind of gels together a lot more. And a little pro tip is that, you know, the difference between stuff like clipping and saturation and compression and all that kind of stuff is not much. You know, it's all about how much you dial these settings in. Essentially, the idea is all the same, is flattening off the peak of a sound and squarifying a sine wave and either adding harmonics or not. And for example, something like a clipper like this, I think is really powerful because it edges the gap between saturator, clipper, very extreme limiter, and that kind of stuff. So again, we're going to stick with hard clip, but you could use this creatively. I don't know if you noticed that now, but like it's very subtle, but the more we squeeze this now, we've got a little bit more room to play with before it feels like that snare starts squeezing the life out of other stuff. But it's because we've literally given it more headroom by clipping the snare channels and percussion channels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and expand this theory, and I will fast forward this bit, and I'm going to kind of get it to as best I can. And then I'm going to show you this idea with the VCAs. What I'm going to do then is render out an example. I'll gain match it to the other example, and we're going to A/B test and see the difference. Two things that I quickly want to discuss before I render it, and we can do some A/B tests. Let me explain to you the theory behind this pre-clip VCA. So the more we turn this up, the more the signal before all the clippers goes up, and the more overall clipping gets applied. So long explanation aside, the quick theory of what this does is this quickly increases or decreases the amount of LUFS in your mix. So if, for example, this is like running through my overall like usual mastering chain. Once I've done the -6 thing, it then goes from -6 and then brings it up to 0 with the true peak and everything already applied. We can then just change this pre-clip VCA to change the amount of LUFS we want in the mix. So this essentially just becomes a loudness knob. One knob that changes the overall amount of loudness in the mix. This is very handy for particular reasons. Say, for example, we don't really want as much loudness. We're kind of thinking, oh, we've overdone it a little bit. We can just turn this down by micro increments, and it decreases the amount of clipping that's happening to the overall mix. So as you can see, I've kind of really fine-tuned it so that there isn't really much clipping actually going on. If we turn this up, you'll see that there's kind of like an overall amount that it doesn't want to go above. And as we turn it down, it's kind of more rounded. Like the tone of the kick and stuff is more rounded. As we turn it up, you can see it kind of squares off a little bit on the very top edges. And right at the top, you can see it's like very square. But it still retains some of the high frequency tone and stuff because we've done it on very micro increments. You know, we've done it on the different channels. We've got this amount tuning. What I want to do is I want to now tune in to the specific amount of LUFS that I want for my mix. So let's say, for example, like a -8. Then I'm going to render it out without the mastering processing on it so that we can gain match it to that original mix and see which one we think sounds the best. So obviously what sounds the best is going to be subjective, and that's up to you. I just want to show you the practical idea behind it, and I think why it's so powerful to quickly be able to change the amount of loudness in a mix. Very, very cool. So one thing also that's become apparent, you know, now that we push things to their absolute limit, a lot more of these little mistakes start to come out. So it feels like this leads channel is maybe a little bit too heavy in the mids. So now we can actually go in and fine tune this to maybe even get a little bit more gain out of the entire mix. Let's say maybe even try push it to like -6. We're not going for numbers, guys. We're not going for numbers. It's about fine-tuning it so that you're not just squaring off your waveform, but at the same time trying to get the most out of the amount of space that we have in that -1 to +1. You know what? I'm not going to push it. I think that actually just sounds so nice and clean. Those leads just cut nicely now. I'm not going to push it. I think -8 is fine. So let's actually just render this out as is, and then we can do some A/B testing. Okay, time for some totally subjective opinions. So notice here, this is the weird thing, is the traditional mix is actually peaking higher than the clip to zero mix, but the loudness is lower. So it's actually triggering the mastering limiter a lot more than the clip to zero one, which sounds objectively much louder. It sounds much louder. So which one sounds better? That's up to you. That's subjective. The theory is that we have a lot more headroom to now push the mastering limiter to make the most of this audio. These little peaks that are coming in here and there from the nuances of the traditional mix aren't going to affect it in maybe unwanted ways that we might not know of while mixing the track. So let's do some A/B testing. So notice how those peaky sounds in the like traditional mix was actually triggering this mastering limiter and this gain reduction a lot more. So yes, of course, the clip to 0 has got gain reduction in the mix. However, we're building the whole mix around the fact that there's going to be gain reduction in the end. We're inevitably, with mastering and stuff, you can't avoid gain reduction. It's always going to happen. So being able to kind of choose where it is, I think, is the powerful thing. So to be able to use it kind of, I guess, creatively, to use it as a building block in the mix, to be able to structure the entire thing around that is incredibly powerful, because then nothing should really change in the master. Nothing should trigger something too much and change the kind of musicality of what you're trying to create. Do you know what I mean? So here, for example, this part, I feel like in the traditional mix, it was really like it was going wild with the gain reduction here. However, with the clip to 0, it was barely even touching it. So we could actually go to the extremes here and kind of see how much we can push it till we start to get like audible bad sound, you know, like audible distortion that we don't like. Let's maybe turn this down a bit because we might start true clipping. Okay, so that is like audibly like starting to sound bad. Let's flip it over to the traditional mix and see the massive difference that we have now. Notice how in the traditional mix there's these kind of unstable motions in the compression because different things are triggering that limiter at different times. Whereas with the clip to 0, it's kind of this very stable movement, you know, groove, groove, groove. Because you've planned everything around the fact that there's definitely going to be that gain reduction, you're able to kind of choose it where, you know, use it kind of to your advantage and use that to kind of get the most loudness out of your mix. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I think that's about it for today. Nice long one. But again, definitely go and check out the original playlist by Buffermetrics. I'm going to post the link in the description. It is long, but it's totally worth it if you want this kind of more high-end mixing techniques to kind of make your mixes sound a little bit more like masters. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that like button. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.